There was a time when the boy couldn't sleep through the night. Every creak of the floorboards sent shivers down his spine. Every dream pulled him back into a darkness he could not escape. But there was one listener who never turned away. A German shepherd, eyes glowing softly in the dim light, who absorbed every whispered secret as though they were sacred vows. This dog had once been cast aside, told he was too much trouble, too far gone. Yet here, in the stillness of night, he became more than a pet. He became the child's shield, his comfort, his silent healer. What makes this story unforgettable is not just the courage of a dog, but the tenderness of a bond that no hardship could break. Because sometimes the greatest heroes don't roar. Sometimes they simply listen, and in that silence, they save us. The barn smelled of damp hay and rusted metal. Wooden rafters creaked overhead as the December wind slipped through cracks in the siding, carrying with it the faint rattle of chains. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the dirt floor, filled with farmers, traders, and curious locals wrapped in heavy coats. The auctioneer's voice echoed from the platform, fast and sharp, as he called out numbers for a set of rusting tools, a few goats, and a stack of feed barrels. No one paid attention to the cage in the corner at first. It wasn't large, just a crude pen of welded wire tucked between two old tractors. Inside, a German shepherd sat perfectly still, his head lowered, his paws crossed in a posture that was almost regal, despite the mud that clung to his fur. A thin scar traced the line of his muzzle, and one ear bent slightly at the tip, a mark of past battles. His eyes, though, his eyes were what stopped strangers mid-breath. They were not the eyes of an ordinary farm dog. They carried weight, the quiet intensity of an animal that had once lived by duty, not survival. Shadow. That had been his name once, though no one here knew it. To them, he was nothing but Lot 47. The auctioneer cleared his throat, slapping the wooden rail with his palm. Next up, we got ourselves a shepherd, retired, I'm told. Strong dog, good for guarding if you have the patience. He gave a crooked grin, but there was no reverence in it, no recognition of what this animal had been. All right, who'll start me at 50? The crowd shifted. A farmer in the second row muttered something about vet bills. Another man chuckled, whispering that the dog looked too old for work. Someone else tapped a boot against the floor, waiting for the next item. The shepherd sat unmoving, his gaze sweeping the barn, searching for something familiar. But there was nothing here. No handler's voice, no clipped commands, no sirens or radios. Only strangers, their eyes sliding past him as if he were already gone. 30 then, the auctioneer barked, lowering the number. 20. 10. A hand finally rose in the back. It belonged to a heavy-set farmer with weathered hands and a thick wool coat. He didn't glance at the dog when he bid. He only saw cheap muscle, another mouth to chain up near his fence. 10. I got 10. Do I hear 15? Silence. Sold. Lot 47. $10 even. The gavel cracked against the block. Just like that, Shadow's future was decided. The farmer walked up, taking the leash from the attendant without ceremony. Shadow stood, the movement fluid, disciplined, though his ribs showed faintly through his coat. He stepped down from the cage, paws pressing into the dirt, as if he were walking into exile. No one clapped, no one lingered. The next item, a battered plow, was rolled forward. The crowd leaned in again, forgetting the dog entirely. but not everyone missed him. In the corner of the barn, a young boy, no older than 12, tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, did you see his eyes? That dog. He looks like he knows." "Know what?" the man muttered, distracted, scribbling notes for the plow. "Everything," the boy whispered. His gaze stayed fixed on the shepherd until the doors closed and the cold swallowed him. Outside, the farmer loaded Shadow into the back of his truck. The shepherd leapt obediently, though his paws slipped on the metal bed. He didn't fight. He didn't whine. He simply lowered himself against the side, his breath fogging in the winter air. The farmer slammed the gate shut, muttering about wasted money if the dog didn't work out. As the truck pulled away, Shadow lifted his head. The barn lights faded into the distance, replaced by endless fields shrouded in frost. His chest rose and fell slowly, as though he understood he was being carried further away from the life he once knew. Memories flickered, shards of another world, a handler's hand brushing his fur after a long shift. The command, "Stay," barked with urgency in the middle of chaos, the weight of a bulletproof vest strapped across his chest. He remembered sirens, the metallic scent of gunpowder, the trembling of a rescued child pressing against his side. And then, nothing. Retirement. Separation. Silence. Now, $10 had written his fate. The truck bounced along back roads, gravel scattering beneath its tires. Shadow kept his body steady, his tail tucked close. He did not know where he was going, but his instincts told him it would not be home. The farmer's property appeared like a shadow against the horizon, a sagging house, fields lined with rotting fence posts, a barn half collapsed under its own roof. The man parked beside a rusted tractor and yanked the leash. Shadow followed, stepping onto frozen ground, each paw pressing into the frost like a soldier marking unfamiliar territory. The farmer tied him to a long chain fixed to a cracked wooden post. "That's you," he muttered. "Guard dogs don't need comfort. Just bark when someone comes." Then he left. Shadow sat, his breath visible in the frigid air. The chain rattled when he shifted, short enough to keep him bound, long enough to let him pace a circle in the dirt. Above him, the sky stretched gray and endless. For hours, he stayed there, watching. A crow landed on the fence, tilting its head toward him before lifting off again. The wind carried faint sounds from the town miles away. A siren in the distance, a train whistle. Shadow's ears twitched. His body remained taut, alert, as though part of him refused to accept this was the end. Night came quickly. Stars pricked the horizon, sharp and cold. The farmer's windows glowed yellow, but no one returned to check on him. Alone, Shadow lowered his head to his paws. The scar on his muzzle caught the moonlight, a pale reminder of battles fought. He had been trained for duty, raised for loyalty, but now the world saw him as nothing. Forgotten. A dog, without purpose. Yet somewhere inside that silence, a stubborn ember remained. A memory of who he was, of what he could still be. The chain might hold him for now, but it would not bury him. Shadow closed his eyes, and the barn's auctioneer's voice echoed in his mind. Cold, careless, final. But beneath it, softer, almost like a whisper, came another voice. His handler's voice, long gone, carried from the depths of memory. "Find them, boy. Don't ever stop." And though no one heard it, Shadow's heart answered. The chain was only 12 feet long, but to Shadow it felt like an entire world. A circle in the dirt, worn smooth by the endless pacing of his paws, marked the boundary of his existence. The post to which he was tethered leaned at an angle, half rotted, but strong enough to keep him bound. Beyond it stretched a broken fence, the wood splintered and sagging, barely holding back the weeds that had grown wild around the farm. Day after day he sat there, the sun rising and falling in silent procession. At first he resisted, tugging, pawing at the chain, scanning for weakness, but it bit into his neck with cold finality, and over time his struggles faded into weary acceptance. He had learned long ago, on the streets with his handler, that patience could mean survival, so he waited. Seasons shifted in a blur of discomfort. In spring, rains came, drenching the earth until his circle of dirt turned to mud. He would sit there, water soaking his fur, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Summer brought heat that burned the ground, leaving the chain hot against his neck. Flies swarmed, and his tongue lolled from exhaustion, yet his ears twitched at every sound as if he were still waiting for a command. When autumn arrived, the wind turned sharp. He would curl against the base of the post, his body braced against gusts that rattled the fence. And winter. Winter was the cruelest of all. Snow piled against his legs, the cold seeping into his bones. The farmer would toss him scraps now and then, sometimes forgetting for days. But Shadow endured. He always endured. At night, the loneliness deepened. The farmhouse windows glowed faintly in the dark, voices carrying across the yard, but none ever reached him. He would lift his head when footsteps crunched in the distance, only to lower it again when they passed him by. The silence pressed in heavy, broken only by the whistle of a distant train or the mournful cry of an owl. Yet his instincts refused to die. Each sound, a rustle in the weeds, the crack of a twig, the low moan of the wind, stirred something inside him. His eyes swept the fields as though danger might emerge at any moment. His ears flicked to catch every faint murmur. Even in captivity, Shadow remained a sentinel, and in the stillness, memories surfaced. Sometimes they came as flashes, the wail of a siren splitting the night, the weight of a Kevlar vest fastened across his chest, the sharp scent of adrenaline in the air. He remembered the way his handler's hand would press briefly against his shoulder before a command. He remembered the words that had once defined his world: seek, stay, find, protect. He had lived for those words. They had been his compass, his purpose. Now, they echoed like ghosts. One night, as frost coated the fields in a silver sheen, Shadow's body tensed at a sound carried on the wind. It was faint, so faint it could have been mistaken for the cry of an animal. But to Shadow, it was different. It was human, fragile, laced with fear. He rose, pulling against the chain until it groaned. His ears pointed toward the distant town. He growled low, his breath fogging in the air. But the farmer never came. The farmhouse lights blinked out one by one, and silence reclaimed the night. Shadow lay back down, though his eyes never closed fully. He drifted in half-sleep, his body still braced, as if waiting for the call of duty that would never come. The days blurred together, but his spirit remained unbroken. He began to mark time, not by the farmer's neglect, but by the shifts of nature itself. The path of the sun across the yard, the calls of migrating geese overhead, the crack of ice as it thawed with spring. He was chained, yes, but in his heart, he remained on patrol. Sometimes children from the nearby road would wander past, pointing at him through the fence. "That dog looks like a soldier," one boy said. Shadow would stand tall, his gaze locking onto theirs. For a moment, the chain disappeared, and he was what he once had been, a guardian, commanding respect without a sound. But when they left, the silence returned. As weeks turned into months, Shadow's body grew lean, his fur dulled. But his eyes, those eyes never changed. They stayed sharp, filled with a quiet vigilance that unsettled anyone who dared look too long. Even the farmer, muttering as he tossed scraps of bread or bone, avoided Shadow's gaze. There was something in it that spoke of judgment, of memory, of promises unbroken. And then, on nights when the wind shifted just right, he would hear it again. Those faint sounds drifting from the direction of the old warehouse, muffled cries, the echo of footsteps, a metallic clink. Each time, Shadow rose, ears pricked, body rigid. His growl would rumble low, vibrating through the chain, as if warning unseen intruders. But no one else noticed. To the farmer, it was nothing. To the townsfolk, the warehouse was just an abandoned ruin. But to Shadow, it was a pulse in the darkness. Something alive, something wrong. The seasons kept turning. Rain, snow, heat. Loneliness pressed down, but his resolve never faded. Every night, he scanned the horizon, watching, listening. He did not know that fate was already moving toward him, that his life on the chain was not the end, but the beginning of something greater. He only knew this: he was not finished. His body might be bound, but his spirit still walked the streets of memory, following sirens, protecting the innocent, waiting for the moment when the world would need him again. And when that moment came, Shadow would be ready. Nights on the farm were heavy, filled with a stillness that pressed down on everything it touched. The wind moved through the empty fields, carrying the smell of damp earth and the faint rustle of weeds against the broken fence. To most, the quiet would have been comforting. But to Shadow, it was never silent enough. He would lie curled against the leaning post, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Yet even in those moments, his ears remained alert, flicking toward every sound. He had lived too many years where silence was a lie, where behind the hush of a dark street, danger waited in the shadows. That part of him had never left. It began subtly, at first, a sound so faint that even the owls circling above ignored it. A metallic rattle, like chains dragged across concrete. Then a muffled cry, carried on the wind and swallowed almost as soon as it came. Shadow's head would snap up, nostrils flaring. He would stare toward the direction of town, muscles tense, a growl rising from deep in his chest. The farmer never heard it. Inside the sagging house, he snored beneath heavy quilts, the television flickering until it cut to static. To him, Shadow's growl was nothing but noise, the restless muttering of a chained dog. "Quiet out there," he'd grunt through the window if the barking grew too insistent, before rolling over to sleep again. But Shadow knew better. Each night, the sounds returned. Sometimes it was the faint rhythm of footsteps, uneven and hurried. Sometimes the whisper of a child's voice, carried across the fields like a ghost. They were never loud, never constant, but enough to stir the sentinel in him awake. He would pace to the end of his chain, circling the dirt until it wore deeper grooves into the earth. His body remained taut, head angled toward the horizon, tail stiff behind him. The growl in his throat was soft, but insistent. A warning not for the farmer, not even for himself, but for the unseen threat he sensed out there in the dark. And always, the chain held him back. There were nights when he lunged so hard that the post shook in the ground. The metal links bit into his neck, cutting off his breath, but he refused to yield. His paws dug trenches into the dirt, as if sheer willpower might lengthen the chain. Yet the world beyond its reach remained closed to him. The cries, the rattles, the whispers, they stayed in the distance, unanswered. When exhaustion forced him down, he would sit rigid, his chest heaving, steam rising from his body in the cold. His ears would swivel, tracing every echo until finally the fields grew quiet again. But even then, his eyes refused to close. He stayed awake, a lone guard in a place that no longer believed it needed one. The farmer's neighbors noticed little. Once, a passing truck slowed as Shadow barked wildly at the fence, his body straining against the chain. The driver leaned out the window, frowning. "That dog's half mad," he muttered, before pressing the gas and disappearing down the road. No one stopped to wonder why the animal barked only at night, only toward the same direction, as if answering a call no human could hear. The loneliness of those hours gnawed at him. Yet beneath the ache of neglect, something else stirred. Something older, fiercer. His instincts, honed through years of service, refused to be silenced. He had been trained to seek, to find, to protect. And even though no handler stood beside him, no voice commanded him, the duty burned still in his chest. He remembered flashes of the past as the cries came to him. The day he tracked a lost child through a rainstorm, paws splashing through mud, until he found the boy curled under a tree. The night he lunged at an armed man, teeth sinking into a sleeve to protect his partner. The soft sobs of a rescued girl pressing her face into his fur, whispering, "Thank you." Those memories were not gone. They lived in him, and they demanded he respond. But the chain refused. One night, the wind carried the sound more clearly than ever. A cry, high-pitched, unmistakable, echoing like the last breath of someone praying not to be forgotten. Shadow bolted upright, barking so fiercely that the farm itself seemed to shudder. His voice tore through the darkness, echoing against barns and fence posts, a desperate call that said, "I hear you. I am here." The farmhouse light flicked on. The farmer stumbled out onto the porch, cursing under his breath. "Shut it, you stupid mutt. Nothing out there but your own shadow." He hurled an empty tin can across the yard. It clattered near the post, sending up sparks of anger in Shadow's chest. But he didn't stop. He barked until his throat ached, until his body shook with the effort, until the cry on the wind faded into silence once more. When the farmer finally stormed back inside, slamming the door, Shadow sank into the dirt. His breath came ragged, his fur damp with frost. Yet his eyes stayed locked on the horizon, a quiet promise in them. He would not forget those sounds. He would not dismiss them as the farmer had. Something was out there. Something is wrong. And when the chance came, if the chain ever broke, if the post ever gave way, he would find it. For now, he waited. The field stretched wide and dark around him, but Shadow remained unyielding. His ears twitched at every rustle. His body braced against every whisper of the wind. Nights echoed with loneliness, yes, but also with anticipation. The kind of restless anticipation that belongs to those who know their purpose has not yet ended. Shadow lowered his head, resting his chin on his paws, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on the distant warehouse he had never seen, but somehow always felt. Inside that place, unseen, children wept in the dark. And on this farm, chained and forgotten, a dog who had once been their kind of guardian refused to let the world ignore them forever. On the edge of town, where the streets bled into fields of broken weeds, the old grain warehouse stood like a forgotten tomb. Its brick walls were mottled with moss and time, the mortar crumbling away in jagged scars. A rusted sign clung crooked above the loading dock, its faded letters spelling out the name of a milling company that had gone bankrupt 20 years earlier. Most who drove past never slowed down. They had grown used to its presence, as if it were just another relic of a town's fading industry, too useless to tear down, too ordinary to notice. By day, it looked abandoned, an empty shell against the horizon. Windows were boarded with warped plywood, and the roof sagged as though it were bowing under the weight of memory. Tall grass grew wild along its foundation, swaying in the wind like a curtain to hide what lived inside. Birds perched on the rafters, circling now and then, before scattering at the smallest disturbance. But by night, the warehouse breathed differently. When the sun fell, shadows spilled across the cracked concrete lot, swallowing the building until it seemed less like a ruin and more like a sentinel, keeping secrets. Headlights would occasionally slice through the dark. An old van, a pickup with its plates obscured by mud. Engines cut quickly, lights extinguished before they reached the dock. Doors would slam softly, and men would step out, their boots crunching against gravel as they slipped into the shadows. They never carried much with them, sometimes boxes, sometimes bags, sometimes nothing at all. But always, their movements carried the same careful rhythm. Quick glances, low voices, the kind of choreography that thrives only when it knows it must not be seen. The warehouse swallowed them. Its doors, rusted and heavy, groaned quietly as they opened just wide enough for men to slip through. Once shut again, silence reclaimed the night. From the road, no one would notice. To the casual passerby, the place was still as a graveyard, forgotten and useless. But there were signs for those who looked closer. Boot prints stamped the mud where no farmer had reason to walk. Cigarette butts collected in corners, fresh despite the decades of supposed abandonment. And now and then, when the wind shifted, faint echoes drifted out. Metal against metal, a muffled sound that might have been machinery, or might have been something else entirely. Locals dismissed it. They had for years. Teenagers breaking in, probably, the gas station attendant once said, waving away the thought. Nobody cares enough to fix it up, so they go in there to drink, God knows what. Not my business. An old man across the street had his own explanation. Rats, he muttered. Building's full of them. Big ones, too. You hear scratching in the night, that's all it is. Rats. And the sheriff's office. Overworked, underfunded, and uninterested in a warehouse that technically hadn't broken a law. Reports came in once or twice. Someone thought they saw lights. Another swore they heard shouting. But paperwork drowned in stacks of more urgent cases, and the warehouse slipped back into anonymity. The traffickers thrived on that neglect. They came and went like phantoms, choosing the deepest hours of night. Their vehicles parked with engines still ticking as they transferred their loads. A rope pulley at the side of the dock lifted heavy boxes inside. From a distance, it looked routine, like men salvaging scrap or clearing out junk. But the boxes carried no salvage. They carried life. Inside those crates, hidden behind false bottoms or wrapped in blankets, children had been smuggled like contraband. And every night they remained, the warehouse became less a ruin and more a prison. The exterior bore no hint of it. To most, it was an eyesore, another structure waiting for the inevitable wrecking crew that never came. Yet to the children within, the cracked bricks and boarded windows were walls of iron, unbreakable, swallowing their cries. Sometimes, when the town was quietest, faint sounds seeped out. A cough, a choked sob, a clink of chains against steel beams. They rode the wind and carried across the empty fields, heard only by ears sharp enough to recognize them. Ears like shadows. Miles away, chained to his post, he would lift his head at those very moments, his body stiff, his ears cutting through the wind. What others dismissed as rats or rusted machinery, he knew as human. He knew as pain. But here, at the warehouse, no one paused long enough to question. The building's silence was its camouflage, its decay, its mask. To the town, it was just another ruin, standing year after year without purpose. To those who trafficked within, it was a perfect sanctuary, hiding their crimes in plain sight, confident that no one would look closer. For now, the warehouse kept its secrets. The doors stayed shut, the windows dark, the night heavy with complicity. But secrets have weight, and like bricks left too long without mortar, they eventually crumble. The air inside the warehouse was stale, thick with the smell of mold, rust, and unwashed bodies. The only light came from a single bulb strung high in the rafters, its weak glow casting long shadows that seemed to swallow everything it touched. Beneath that bulb, 12 children huddled against cold concrete walls, their small frames bent by exhaustion. Chains rattled whenever one shifted, the sound sharp, metallic, and constant. They sat in 2 uneven rows, each shackled by the ankle to pipes or steel beams that lined the warehouse interior. Their wrists bore raw marks from bindings that had long since rubbed the skin red. Hunger had hollowed their cheeks. Fear had dulled their voices. At night, when the traffickers' boots echoed across the concrete floor, every child froze. The footsteps were heavy, measured, reminders of the men who watched them. Sometimes the boots paused directly in front of them, a shadow looming overhead. A hand would yank a chain, tugging one child forward to remind them how little control they had. The threats came low, whispered but razor-sharp. Make a sound, and you'll regret it. The children rarely spoke in daylight. Silence had been beaten into them, a survival instinct that overrode even their longing to cry. But when the dark thickened, when the men retreated to the far office or slipped out to smoke near the loading dock, whispers rose in the shadows. "I miss my mom," one boy murmured, his voice trembling like a candle flame. He was no older than 8, his knees drawn tight to his chest. "She'll come," a girl beside him whispered back, though her own eyes betrayed doubt. She was older, maybe 11, her hair tangled into knots, her hands trembling against the chain. "She'll come for you. Someone will." Another boy, curled in the corner, shook his head. "No one knows where we are. They don't tell." His voice cracked on the last word, breaking into silence. The youngest, a girl no older than 5, pressed her face into her knees, whispering words no one understood. A prayer, maybe, or just the echo of lullabies she barely remembered. Above them, the bulb flickered, buzzing faintly. The children shrank deeper into the shadows, as though light itself might betray them. The traffickers treated the warehouse like a machine, and the children were its parts, replaceable, voiceless, unseen. Orders were barked from the office in clipped tones. the kind used to discuss cargo, not lives. Meals, if they could be called that, were scraps, crusts of bread, cans of beans shared among them. Water came from a bucket that smelled faintly of rust, and yet, in the quiet moments between fear, the children clung to each other. One boy, thin as bone, hummed softly when the nights grew longest. It wasn't a song anyone recognized, but it filled the silence just enough to steady their breathing. Another girl shared stories in a whisper, half memory, half imagination. She spoke of her house, with curtains that smelled of lavender, of a swing that hung from a maple tree. She described Christmas mornings with warmth in her voice, as though by speaking them aloud, she could bring them closer. They listened, wide-eyed, desperate to hold on to something beyond these walls. But the footsteps always returned, heavy, certain. A door slamming would send silence rushing back into the group. The humming stopped. The stories ended mid-sentence. Even the prayers fell quiet. The men walked among them like wardens inspecting property. Sometimes they laughed, their voices echoing cruelly across the space. Other times, they spoke in low conversations the children could not understand, words about transport, about waiting until the next buyer. Those words cut deeper than chains. The children didn't know what they meant, but they understood enough. They were not safe. Every so often, one of the older children tested the chains, pulling quietly when the men were gone. But the steel didn't budge. The walls held, and despair settled heavier each time. Yet there was one thing the traffickers could not chain. Hope lived in fragments, in the way a child squeezed another's hand when fear threatened to overwhelm them, in the way whispered promises were traded back and forth. We'll get out. They'll find us. We won't stay forever. Still, doubt seeped in like the damp. What if they don't? The youngest once asked, her voice so small it barely carried across the floor. The silence that followed was heavier than chains. No one answered. They couldn't. The warehouse at night was both prison and cocoon, trapping them, but also binding them together. And though their bodies weakened, their eyes, wide, haunted, still searched the dark for any sign of rescue. Sometimes, when the air grew stillest, they thought they heard something. A dog barking far away, a sound that rose above the hum of the trafficker's van, above the moan of the wind against the siding. A dog's voice, fierce and relentless. The children froze whenever they heard it, afraid the men might notice their sudden stirrings. But deep inside, something flickered. A recognition. A fragile spark. The barking didn't reach them fully, not yet. But it existed. Out there, beyond the boarded windows, beyond the rusted locks, something alive was fighting against the silence. And for a moment, the children dared to believe. The warehouse had gone quiet again. The men had retreated to their office in the far corner, voices muffled behind the heavy door. The single bulb above the children flickered, casting slow-moving shadows across the floor, like restless ghosts. In that silence, fear settled thick in the air. The children huddled close, their breath shallow, each one clinging to the small comfort of another's presence. But even pressed together, the cold of the concrete seeped into their bones. Among them lay a girl no older than 7. Her hair was tangled into knots, strands falling over her face as she shifted against the chain that bound her ankle to a steel pipe. Her name was Eliza. The others rarely heard her speak. She was small, her voice softer than the rest, as if fear had taught her to swallow her words before they reached her lips. But that night, as the bulb buzzed above them, Eliza pressed her cheek to the cold floor and whispered, "Oh, please, somebody, please come." The words slipped out, trembling, almost too faint to hear. Her lips brushed against the concrete as she spoke, her breath fogging lightly against its chill. She closed her eyes, as if by shutting out the darkness around her, she might send her words farther. "I want to go home," she murmured. "I want my mom." No one answered. The others listened in silence, their own hearts aching with the truth of her plea. Some wanted to hush her, afraid the traffickers might hear, but none could find the strength. Her words carried something they all felt, but had not dared to speak aloud. A desperate hope, fragile and trembling, yet stronger than silence. Her hands curled into fists against the ground. She whispered again, this time as though praying, "Don't let me die here. Please, send somebody, anybody." The bulb above gave a sudden spark, dimmed, then steadied again. The children exchanged nervous glances, as if even the light itself trembled at her prayer. Outside, the night wind shifted. It rolled across the fields, sweeping over cracked roads and empty barns, carrying faint echoes farther than they should have traveled. Miles away, chained to his post at the broken fence, Shadow stirred. His head lifted from his paws, ears pricking. The wind touched his fur, carrying with it something more than sound, something deeper, more primal. He could not explain it, but he felt it all the same. His body stiffened. His ears swiveled toward the horizon. His breath quickened, forming white puffs in the cold air. Then came a sound, so faint no human could have caught it. A murmur, a plea, carried on the wind. Shadow growled low, a sound that rumbled in his chest like distant thunder. His paws pressed against the ground, claws digging into the dirt as if ready to run. The chain clinked, pulling tight, keeping him bound. But his eyes burned with focus, staring into the night as though he could see straight through the miles of darkness, straight into the warehouse where the children lay. Back inside, Eliza whispered again, her cheek still against the concrete. "Please, God, send a dog. Send an angel. Somebody who won't leave us." The children around her shifted uneasily. One boy brushed at his eyes with the back of his hand. A girl pressed closer, laying her hand over Eliza's as if to anchor her words. They all felt it. That what she spoke was not just a child's rambling, but something more, something reaching outward, begging the world to listen. And somehow, far away, a forgotten dog did. Shadow pulled against the chain, muscles rippling under his coat, straining with a force that made the post groan in the earth. His breath came in short bursts, his growl building into a bark that shattered the stillness of the farm. He barked once, twice, 3 times, each one fierce, urgent, as if answering a call that no one else could hear. The farmer cursed from inside the house, his voice muffled by walls. "Shut it, dog. Nothing out there." But Shadow didn't stop. His voice carried into the night, cutting through the cold, echoing across fields. To anyone else, it was just barking, meaningless noise from a restless animal. But to him, it was more. It was a promise. Back in the warehouse, the children heard nothing. The thick walls and distance muffled any sound from reaching them. But Eliza's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in days, her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. I think someone heard me," she whispered. The others looked at her in confusion, but none of them dared to tell her she was wrong, for in that moment, even without proof, they all wanted to believe it too. Hope was a fragile thing, but once spoken, it spread. The bulb above buzzed again, light trembling in its socket. The shadows seemed to shift along the walls, less suffocating, almost retreating for a moment. The children sat a little straighter, their chains clinking softly as they leaned toward one another, as though drawing warmth from her small words. And outside, Shadow lowered his head again, but his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. His ears stayed sharp, waiting. He had heard something. Maybe not words, maybe not sound, but something deeper. Something that told him his waiting was not in vain. The night pressed on. The traffickers smoked near their van, laughing in the distance. The children huddled close, Eliza's whispered prayer still hanging in the air. And miles away, a dog once abandoned remained restless, his heart beating in rhythm with cries he could not ignore. The storm announced itself long before it arrived. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened into a bruised shade of gray, thick clouds tumbling across the horizon. The air turned sharp and metallic, carrying the scent of snow. Crows scattered from the fields, their cries lost in the rising wind. On the neglected farm, Shadow felt it first. His fur bristled as the gusts whipped across the yard, rattling the broken fence like dry bones. The chain at his neck jingled sharply each time he shifted. The sound carried away into the vast emptiness of the land. He lowered his head against the cold, ears twitching, body tense in a way that no farmer would notice but every handler would have recognized. He was bracing for impact. By nightfall, the storm fell hard. Snow lashed sideways, driven by a wind that screamed against the farmhouse siding. The barn groaned with every gust, its roof sagging under the weight of ice. The farmer had drawn his curtains tight and settled inside with the crackle of the television for company. He had forgotten the dog tethered to the post outside, or perhaps he had chosen not to remember. Shadow stood exposed to the fury of the storm. Snow clung to his coat in patches, melting against the warmth of his skin before freezing again in icy clumps. He shivered, his body trembling as he tucked himself low against the earth. The chain pulled taut when he tried to curl into the base of the post for shelter. The wind carried no mercy. It tore through him as if trying to strip life from his bones. Yet, even in the storm's howl, Shadow listened. Between the blasts of wind, between the rattling of loose tin on the barn, he caught it, so faint it might have been mistaken for the groan of the storm itself. A sound softer than snow falling, fragile enough that no human ear could have claimed it. A cry. Shadow's head snapped up, ears pricking forward. His body stilled, his breath fogging in the frozen air. The storm roared, drowning everything, but still, there it was again. A whimper, distant, carried like a thread through the chaos. He turned toward it, his gaze locked on the horizon. His muscles tightened, the sentinel in him rising to the surface. That sound didn't belong to the storm. It belonged to something alive, something in pain. The wind screamed louder, dragging the cry away, but Shadow would not let it vanish. He rose to his feet, body rigid, and barked once into the night. The sound tore from his chest, swallowed almost instantly by the storm's fury. But he didn't stop. He barked again, louder, straining against the chain until the links rattled against the post. Inside the farmhouse, the farmer stirred irritably, pulling the quilt over his head. "Stupid mutt," he muttered, half asleep, deaf to the urgency outside. Shadow kept barking, his voice raw and defiant against the storm. Each sound was an answer to the cry he had heard, a vow cast into the wind. "I hear you. You're not alone." Snow piled higher around his legs, numbing his paws. The chain bit against his neck each time he lunged, but he did not relent. His eyes stayed locked on the dark horizon, his ears tuned to every fragile note carried through the blizzard. And again, yes, again, he heard it. A child's sob, faint, fleeting, yet unmistakable. Shadow growled low, a deep rumble that vibrated in his chest, building into a bark that shook the silence of the farm. He lunged harder this time, muscles straining until the post shuddered in the ground. The chain pulled him back, choking off his breath, but he dug his claws deep into the frozen earth. His body trembled with effort, with desperation. The storm raged, tearing branches from trees, slamming shutters against the farmhouse. But none of it mattered to Shadow. All that mattered was the sound carried on the wind, the one no one else could hear. The world had forgotten him, chained him, dismissed him as useless. But tonight, the storm had delivered a message only he could answer. And his instincts, the instincts honed from years of service, burned hot in his blood. He was not finished. Shadow pressed forward again, the chain biting deeper, the post groaning as if warning it could not hold forever. Snow swirled around him, covering the yard in white, but his eyes stayed sharp, fixed on a point far beyond sight. The storm did its best to bury the cries, but he had heard them once. That was enough. Shadow would not forget. He stood in the fury of the storm, shivering, his body battered, but his spirit unbroken. He barked until his throat ached, until his breath came ragged, until his body sagged with exhaustion. And even then, when he finally lowered himself to the frozen ground, his ears stayed forward, his gaze locked on the horizon. The storm could howl, the farmer could ignore him, the chain could bind him, but nothing could silence what he had heard. Out there, somewhere in the dark, children were crying, and Shadow was listening. The storm showed no mercy. Snow fell in sheets, coating the yard until it looked like a barren wasteland of white. The wind screamed around the farmhouse, rattling windows, slamming loose boards against the barn with hollow thuds. Shadow stood braced against the gale, his body trembling with cold, and something fiercer, an instinct that clawed at his chest, demanding action. The cries he had heard still echoed in his ears. They were faint, yes, but they were real. And every part of him, every scar, every breath of training that had ever defined his life, told him the same truth. He could not ignore them. The chain tightened around his neck as he lunged forward. The iron links rattled violently, pulling him back with a sharp choke. He staggered, but did not yield. He dug his paws deep into the frozen ground and pulled again, harder this time, muscles rippling under his soaked fur. The post groaned. The rusted metal collar bit into his skin. Pain shot down his neck and shoulders, but he growled, low and relentless, and pulled again. The ground beneath him turned slick with melting snow and mud. His paws slipped, spraying clumps of earth behind him, but he braced, claws scraping, body lowering into the stance of a fighter, refusing to fall. His breath came out in bursts of steam, ragged and harsh, but his eyes stayed fixed on the dark horizon. He remembered moments like this. The doors of drug dens kicked open in a spray of splinters, his handler shouting, "Go!" as Shadow barreled forward. The times he had pulled against leashes to reach trapped victims, his body driven by something greater than fear. He had broken through barriers before. He would again. Another lunge, another choke. His throat burned raw where the collar cut deep, but his growl only grew louder. The wind howled, mocking him. The chain held, trembling but unbroken. Shadow refused to stop. He shifted his weight, lowering his chest nearly to the ground, claws gouging trenches in the mud. He leaned into the pull, every muscle in his body straining, his growl turning into a snarl that ripped through the storm. The post shuddered, wood creaking, dirt loosening at its base. The cries were in his ears again. Imagined or real, it didn't matter. He barked into the storm, answering them, vowing through every sound that he was coming, that he would not let chains silence him when someone needed him. One more lunge. The lynx shrieked. Rust cracked like brittle bone. Shadow's paws slipped, his body crashing to the ground. The chain whipped taut again, cutting into his neck so sharply that for a moment, darkness threatened to swallow his vision. He lay there, chest heaving, his body trembling with fatigue. Snow clung to his muzzle, freezing against his breath. But then, he rose again, slowly, stubbornly. His handler's voice lived in him, deeper than memory, etched into his bones. "Find them, boy. Don't stop." Shadow lowered his head, eyes narrowing. He pulled, harder than before. Every tendon, every scar, every ounce of muscle surged forward in one final act of defiance. His claws tore furrows in the mud, his legs shaking under the weight of his own determination. The sound of snapping metal ripped through the storm. And then, silence. The chain fell slack. Shadow staggered forward, nearly collapsing under the sudden freedom. For a heartbeat, he froze, disbelieving. The post behind him leaned at an angle. The ring at his collar split open, twisted where rust had finally surrendered to force. The lynx dragged behind him, clinking softly against the frozen ground. No longer an anchor, but a trail of what he had left behind. For the first time in years, he was free. Shadow stood trembling in the storm, his chest heaving, his breath coming in white bursts. The wind tore at him, snow blinding his eyes, but none of it mattered. He took a step, then another. His body screamed from exhaustion, but his spirit surged with something deeper than strength. Purpose. The cries were out there. The storm had tried to bury them, but he had heard them once, and that was enough. He turned toward the direction of the sound, his ears pricked, his tail low but steady. His paws pressed into the snow, leaving deep imprints in the whiteness, each one a mark of defiance against the years that had stolen his freedom. Behind him, the farmhouse windows glowed dimly, the farmer oblivious. He would wake in the morning to find only a broken post and a slack chain in the yard. But by then, Shadow would already be gone. He pressed forward into the storm, his body leaning into the wind. Snow lashed against him, but he moved with the relentless pace of a soldier who had been called to duty. His paws crunched through drifts, his ears cutting through the storm's roar. He no longer felt the cold as a punishment. It was only background to the urgency that burned hotter in his chest than any fire. The chain was broken. The world was open again, and somewhere, out there in the dark, 12 children cried into the night. Shadow did not stop to rest, did not stop to doubt. He was coming. The world beyond the fence was white chaos. The storm roared with a voice that seemed to come from the heavens themselves, shaking the land with its fury. Snow whipped in every direction, blinding, stinging, smothering. The ground vanished beneath drifts, and the horizon disappeared into a blur of gray and black. Shadow didn't hesitate. The moment the chain snapped, he lunged forward, his paws striking the frozen earth with new purpose. The lynx still clattered faintly behind him, dragging like a ghost of his captivity, but they no longer slowed him. He was free, and freedom surged through his veins like fire. The wind battered him, pressing hard against his chest, but he lowered his head and drove forward. His muscles burned, his lungs ached with the cold, but he pressed on. Every sense in him was alive, sharpened by the storm and something greater, the cries. He couldn't hear them clearly now, not with the wind howling so violently, but the memory of them pulled him like an unbreakable leash. Each paw print carved deep into the snow was more than movement. It was defiance. For years, he had been bound, waiting, his purpose ignored. Now, the world had called to him again, and he would not falter. The storm tested him. Snowdrifts swallowed his legs to the chest, forcing him to leap and dig, his claws scraping at frozen ground beneath. The icy wind cut into his ears and eyes until tears froze against his fur. But Shadow kept running. His breath came in white bursts, rhythmic and steady, the sound of a soldier pushing through enemy fire. Behind him, the farmhouse grew smaller, its weak lights flickering like dying embers. Ahead stretched nothing but darkness, fields of snow merging into woods that swayed and groaned in the gale. The storm screamed, but within its voice, Shadow's instincts picked out something different. Faint threads of sound, fragile but unmistakable. The cries. They wove through the storm like whispers through smoke. A sob, a clink of metal, a plea too soft for human ears. But not for his. His ears flicked, his body angled, and he turned toward the pull of those voices, as if guided by an invisible hand. He ran harder. The fields gave way to a tree line, branches whipping at his sides as he darted into the woods. The forest floor was a treacherous mess of snow and ice, but his paws found purchase, claws gripping roots and frozen soil. He weaved between trunks, his body low and fluid, his eyes gleaming in the dimness like embers refusing to die. Flashes of memory surged with each step, his handler's voice shouting commands, the flash of red and blue lights across wet asphalt, the sound of a child crying in an alley, his own bark breaking the silence. Those moments fueled him now, reminding him that he had been trained for this, not to give up, not to turn away, but to press forward until the mission was done. The storm raged around him, but Shadow carried his own storm inside. Time blurred. He did not know how long he had been running, only that the voices grew stronger. Each step tightened the connection, pulling him closer, driving him faster. His body screamed for rest, but his spirit drove him on. At last, through the haze of snow, the outline of the warehouse rose from the horizon. It stood like a giant in the dark, its shape broken and jagged, its walls scarred by time. To anyone else, it would have looked like just another ruin swallowed by winter. But Shadow's eyes locked on it with certainty. This was the place. His entire body stiffened as recognition surged through him. The cries had led him here. He slowed at the edge of the lot, his paws crunching against frozen gravel. The storm battered the walls, rattling loose sheets of metal, moaning through broken eaves. The building loomed silent, a predator disguised as a corpse. Shadow's ears twitched, picking up faint sounds from within. Chains, whispers, the small, muffled sobs of children. He growled, low and steady, his breath fogging in the icy air. His fur stood on end, his body coiled like a spring ready to strike. Every instinct in him screamed that danger lived here, but so did the ones who had called for him. The storm howled louder, as if urging him back, as if testing his resolve. Shadow did not move. His chest rose and fell in heavy bursts, his eyes locked on the building. And his mission was clear. For the first time in years, his heart beat with the rhythm of purpose. Not as a chained dog, not as Lot 47, not as a forgotten relic sold for $10, but as Shadow, the sentinel, the rescuer, the loyal protector. He had heard the call, and he had answered. The storm lashed against him, but he stood firm, staring at the warehouse that hid 12 stolen lives. His growl built into a bark, one that cracked through the blizzard and echoed against the building's walls. It was a warning, a challenge, a promise. And though no one heard it but the night, the children inside seemed to stir, their small hearts beating just a little faster, their eyes lifting from the floor, as though sensing that something outside was fighting its way toward them. Shadow lowered his head, his body tense with determination. He had found the place. The next step would come with claws and teeth and the voice of a dog who had never stopped listening. The storm had carried him here. The cries had guided him, and nothing, not wind, not cold, not walls, not men, would stop him now. The storm battered the warehouse with relentless fury, snow swirling like a shroud around its broken walls. From a distance, it looked as lifeless as it always had, an abandoned husk crouched against the horizon. But not tonight. Tonight, something stirred against its silence. Out of the storm's white haze, Shadow emerged. His body hunched against the wind, his fur plastered with ice. He moved like a soldier returning to the battlefield, his breath heavy, his eyes locked on the structure before him. He paused only once, ears flicking, as if to confirm the faint voices inside. Then he surged forward. He circled the warehouse, paws crunching across frozen gravel. His nose pressed against the base of the walls, claws scraping at the gaps between boards, searching for weakness. His body quivered, not from the cold, but from urgency. The cries were here. The scent of fear seeped through cracks in the walls. Sweat, unwashed bodies, and something darker. Despair. Shadow barked. Once, twice. Then again, louder. The sound tore through the storm, a defiant roar that echoed against the walls. He lunged at the nearest door, his claws raking against rotted wood, splinters catching in his pads. He barked again, his body slamming into the planks, teeth snapping at the rusted handle. Inside, 12 children froze. The bulb above them flickered, as if startled by the noise. For days, weeks, they had lived in silence, broken only by the footsteps of their captors. But now there was something different. A sound alive, fierce, urgent. A dog. The youngest gasped, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" The older girl, who often whispered stories, pressed her hands to her mouth, tears welling. "It's real," she whispered back, voice trembling. "It's a dog." "There's a dog outside." The chains rattled as the children shifted, straining against their bonds to hear better. Hope surged in their chests, sharp and sudden, almost painful. Shadow clawed harder. His body slammed into the door again, the hinges groaning but holding. His bark became relentless, rolling through the storm like a drumbeat of defiance. He circled to another wall, throwing his weight against it, claws scraping concrete, growls echoing like thunder. The traffickers stirred. Behind the office door, one cursed, his chair scraping as he stood. "What the hell is that?" Another voice answered, sharp with irritation. "Just the storm. Nothing gets out here." But the barking grew louder. One of the men stomped toward the main floor, boots heavy on the concrete. He froze when he heard it clearly, a dog's snarl pressed against the warehouse wall. His eyes darted to the children, who sat wide-eyed, their chains trembling with nervous energy. He cursed again, spitting on the floor. Damn strays! Always nosing where they don't belong. He grabbed a length of pipe and stomped toward the door, but Shadow was faster. As the man reached the edge of the room, Shadow slammed against the outer wall, snarling so ferociously that the children flinched, even from inside. The man froze. For a heartbeat, fear flickered in his eyes. This wasn't the sound of a wandering stray. This was something else, something trained, something relentless. He backed away, muttering, and disappeared into the office again. The children whispered frantically now. He's real. He's not leaving. He found us. Eliza, the girl who had prayed into the concrete, lifted her head. For the first time in weeks, her eyes burned with life. She pressed her hands together, whispering, "It's him. Somebody came." Shadow barked again, his voice a war cry against the storm. He circled to the loading dock, leaping at the steel doors, teeth gnashing against frozen metal. Sparks of rust flew beneath his claws. He growled, deep and guttural, shaking the silence that had once sealed this place. The storm raged, but his voice cut through it. Again and again, he barked, clawed, lunged, refusing to be ignored. His body slammed into wood, into steel, into anything that might give way. Each impact left his muscles aching, but he did not falter. His mission was clear. Inside, the children leaned forward, their chains rattling like a chorus of urgency. They whispered over and over, voices trembling with a mixture of awe and desperation. "Don't stop. Don't leave. Please don't leave." Shadow's chest heaved, his throat raw, but his eyes stayed sharp, his ears tuned to their voices, even if he couldn't hear them clearly. He circled once more, barking at every wall, every seam of the warehouse, as if mapping the prison with sound and fury. His paws bled from splinters and rust, but he ignored the pain. The traffickers cursed again in their office, debating whether to step outside, whether to silence the dog. But the storm was fierce, and fear kept them hesitant. They muttered, argued, but did not act. So Shadow continued, undeterred. The children's eyes followed the sound as it moved, hope blooming like fire in their chests. Every bark, every scratch, every thud was proof. The world had not forgotten them. Something alive, something fierce, was fighting for them. Eliza pressed her face to the floor, tears streaking her cheeks, and whispered again, only this time not in despair, but in belief. "He's here. He's really here." And in the storm outside, Shadow answered with a bark so loud, so desperate, it rattled the warehouse walls. The storm clawed at every window pane in the small farmhouse, rattling them in their frames like fists demanding entry. Inside, the old radiator hissed and clanked, pushing warmth into the rooms where a young couple tried to ignore the weather and drift into uneasy sleep. It was past midnight when the sound began. At first, it was faint, just a distant bark, muffled by snow and wind. Emma Turner rolled onto her side, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "That dog again," she muttered, her voice heavy with fatigue. "He's been going on for hours." Her husband Caleb groaned into the pillow. "Probably some stray got caught in the storm. He'll quiet down when he gives up." But the barking didn't fade. It grew louder, sharper, each sound cutting through the roar of the blizzard like a blade. Bark after bark, relentless, each one more desperate than the last. Emma sat up, brushing her dark hair from her eyes. "That's not normal," she whispered. "Listen to him." Caleb sighed, dragging himself upright. He was a practical man, not easily stirred by stray animals. But even he frowned as the barking carried on, fierce and unyielding, punctuated by the scrape of claws against something solid. "That's no coyote," he muttered. The couple exchanged a look in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. Annoyance lingered, but beneath it, something else stirred. Unease. Caleb pulled on his boots and heavy coat, the seams creaking as he zipped it to his chin. Emma wrapped herself in a scarf, her flashlight clutched tight in her hand. The storm beat against them the moment they stepped outside, snow stinging their faces, wind threatening to steal their breath. "Over there," Emma said, pointing through the blur. "It's coming from the warehouse." Caleb narrowed his eyes, squinting against the snow. The warehouse stood at the edge of their land, a crumbling giant that had been abandoned longer than either of them had been alive. They had always dismissed it, just as everyone else in town did. But tonight, the sound drew them toward it, like a beacon. They trudged through drifts, their boots sinking deep, flashlights slicing thin tunnels of light into the storm. The barking grew louder with every step, raw and furious, echoing against the warehouse walls until it seemed to shake the night itself. Emma gripped Caleb's arm. "It doesn't sound like a stray. It sounds trained, like he's trying to tell someone something." Caleb didn't answer. He kept moving, his jaw tight, his breath puffing white in the dark. As they neared the warehouse, the beam of Emma's flashlight caught movement. A German shepherd, his fur matted with snow, his body slamming against the steel doors again and again. His claws raked at the rusted metal, leaving streaks of red where his pads had torn. His eyes gleamed in the light, wild, desperate, unwavering. "Oh my God," Emma breathed. "Look at him." The dog barked at them once, sharp and commanding, before turning back to the door as if to say, "Don't waste time. Help me." Caleb felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. This was no lost pet. This was something else, something urgent. The storm howled around them, but beneath it, they thought they heard something more. Emma tilted her head, straining, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Caleb froze, listening. And there it was, a faint sound, muffled but distinct. A cry, a child's cry. His stomach dropped. "No." Emma's voice cracked, tears already rising in her eyes. She turned the flashlight back on the dog, who was clawing frantically, his body heaving with effort. "Caleb, there are children in there." The realization hit them like a blow. What they had dismissed as an abandoned ruin was not empty at all. It was a cage. Caleb's grip tightened on the flashlight until his knuckles whitened. "We need to call the sheriff, now!" Emma fumbled with her phone, her fingers stiff from the cold. The screen glowed, her voice shaking as she tried to steady it. Yes, this is Emma Turner, out on Route 17, near the old grain warehouse. She broke off, her voice faltering as she looked at the dog. His body slammed against the door again, a growl ripping from his chest. "There's something happening here. You need to come. Please, hurry." The dispatcher's voice crackled through static, promising to send deputies immediately. Emma lowered the phone, her heart pounding. Caleb pulled her close, shielding her from the wind as they both stared at the shepherd. The dog had stopped barking long enough to meet their eyes again. In that gaze was something more than instinct. It was pleading, demanding. Don't turn away. Emma felt tears slip down her cheeks, freezing in the storm. "He found them," she whispered. "He found them when no one else did." The barking began again, louder than before, echoing through the storm like a war cry. This time, it was not just a dog calling into the void. It was an alarm, a summons. A voice refusing to let the world stay silent. And the couple knew then. They weren't just witnesses. They were part of this now. The shepherd had dragged them into a fight, far greater than they had expected. Together, they turned toward the storm-lit road, waiting for the glow of approaching headlights. Inside the warehouse, 12 children stirred, hope blooming faint and trembling. And outside, Shadow's voice did not stop. The storm had quieted the town, pressing everyone into their homes, shutters latched, heaters humming. But above the gale, one sound would not relent. Bark after bark split the night, sharp, ragged, furious. Shadow's voice tore through the storm like a siren, echoing across fields and back roads. He slammed his body against the warehouse doors, claws raking wood until splinters clung to his pads. His throat burned raw, but he did not stop. Each bark was a cry of urgency, a command to anyone listening. Come now. Do not wait. The Turners stood near the loading dock, their flashlights catching glimpses of the dog's frantic figure. Emma clutched Caleb's arm, her breath coming fast, her phone still open in her hand. "They have to hurry," she whispered. "God, please let them hurry." Her words proved true. Lights began to flicker across the nearby fields, porch lamps snapping on as neighbors stirred. The sound of Shadow's barking had traveled farther than they thought, carried by the storm's shifting winds. In one farmhouse, an old man pushed open his curtain, frowning into the white blur. "That shepherd again," he muttered, pulling on his coat. By the time he stepped outside, his granddaughter had already grabbed her phone, dialing the sheriff's office with trembling hands. In another house, a family eating late supper froze at the sound. "That's not just barking," the mother whispered, setting down her fork. She hurried to the window, her heart racing. Listen. That's something else." She dialed too, her voice quick and urgent. "Yes, we're near the mill road. A dog's gone mad at the old warehouse. You need to come. Please. Something's wrong." Soon, phones glowed across the valley, blue light flashing against faces, pale with unease. One by one, calls poured into the sheriff's office, overlapping, frantic, describing the same thing. A dog, barking without pause, slamming against the doors of a place that should have been long forgotten. Back at the warehouse, Shadow did not relent. His claws tore grooves into the wood, his body jolting with each impact. Snow clung to his coat, his legs trembled from exhaustion, but his eyes blazed with the same fire that had once driven him into raids, into rescues, into chaos. Inside, the children clung to the sound like lifelines. Each bark made them lift their heads a little higher, their eyes wide with something they had nearly lost. Hope. "They're coming," one boy whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. Eliza pressed her cheek against the cold pipe that bound her ankle, tears streaking her face. "He won't stop. He's not leaving us." And outside, Shadow barked again, his voice splitting the storm like lightning. Down the road, headlights appeared. A deputy's cruiser cut through the snow, its red and blue lights muted in the whiteout, but still unmistakable. Another followed, then another. The Turners stepped into the road, waving their arms, guiding them toward the warehouse. "He's here!" Caleb shouted, pointing. "The dog! He won't let it go!" The deputies climbed out, their boots crunching on ice. For a moment, they froze, watching the shepherd slam himself into the door with such violence it rattled in its frame. One officer whispered, almost in awe, "That's no stray." "Check inside," another barked, already moving toward the dock. Shadow leapt aside only long enough to let them see what he had been guarding. Then he threw himself forward again, barking furiously, as if demanding they act faster. The storm howled around them, but the scene had shifted. What had been silence and neglect was now alive with voices, neighbors gathering, deputies shouting into radios, the crackle of dispatch echoing through static. All units respond. Possible hostages. Old grain warehouse. The children inside heard it too. A new sound, faint but undeniable. The crackle of radios outside the walls. Their chains rattled as they shifted, eyes wide, breaths sharp with sudden hope. "They're here," someone whispered. "The police are here." The traffickers in the office stiffened. One cursed violently, pacing, pulling at his hair. "It's the damn dog," he hissed. "He brought them here." But Shadow could not hear their rage. He heard only the cries, the calls, the rushing feet of men and women who had finally answered him. His body quivered with exhaustion, but his voice rose again, carrying above the storm, relentless as ever. The alarm had spread. The town had woken. And Shadow, forgotten, discarded, chained for years, had become the voice that shattered the silence. The storm battered the warehouse walls, snow lashing the steel like a drumbeat of urgency. Patrol cars lined the road, their red and blue lights swallowed by white blur, streaking the snow with eerie color. Deputies moved fast, flashlights cutting through the night, radios crackling urgent codes. Above it all, Shadow's voice. Bark after bark, hoarse yet relentless, driving men forward. He hurled himself at the heavy doors, claws raking at the seams, as if willpower alone could rip them open. Deputy Morales, the youngest, whispered, "He won't stop. It's like he knows." Sheriff Donnelly gripped a crowbar tighter. "All right, let's get this open." The deputies braced their shoulders against the frame. Shadow leapt aside, snarling at the steel, urging them on. One strike, splintering wood, another, hinges groaning. The storm swallowed the sound, but neighbors huddled nearby flinched with each blow. "Again," Donnelly barked. The crowbar bit deep. With a violent pop, the lock snapped. The doors flew wide. The smell hit them first. Mold, sweat, fear. It rolled out into the freezing night, choking throats with the truth of what had been hidden here. Flashlights swept the dark. Beams found rows of concrete pillars, rusted beams, and then small figures huddled against the walls, 12 children. Eyes wide, gleaming in the light. Faces pale, hollow. Chains clinked faintly as they recoiled, shielding themselves from sudden brightness. The deputies froze. "Dear God," one breathed. A sob broke the silence. A boy, no older than 7, buried his face in his knees, his thin shoulders trembling. His chain rattled, slicing through the deputies like a blade. Donnelly dropped the crowbar. His voice cracked. "Get those kids out. Now." They moved fast. Radios blared calls for ambulances, child services, anyone available. Bolt cutters flashed. Deputies crouched low, their voices gentle. "It's all right," Morales whispered to a girl with tangled hair, fumbling at the shackle on her ankle. "You're safe now. We've got you." But she only stared, lips trembling, as if rescue were too impossible to believe. And then Shadow pushed forward. His paws skidded on concrete as he nosed into their circle. He pressed against small hands, small faces, and let out a soft whine. Reassurance in a language older than words. The children reacted to him first. Hands reached shakily for his fur, clutching as though he were the only solid thing in the world. Tears broke free, sobs echoing through the cavern. For weeks they had whispered prayers into the dark. And here was the answer. A dog who had not stopped until the world listened. The deputy's eyes burned. Hardened men muttered curses under their breath, not at the children, but at the monsters who had done this. Each chain that snapped rang like a bell announcing freedom. A boy stumbled forward, his shackles split open. His knees gave way, but strong arms caught him. "You're all right, kid," Morales whispered. "We've got you." Nearby, a girl clung to her pipe even after the lock fell. Her fingers shook too violently to let go. Shadow moved to her. He pressed his nose against her hand, steady and warm. She flinched, then froze. Slowly, her fingers uncurled from the metal and tangled in his fur instead. She buried her face in his neck, sobbing. Shadow's tail gave a single thump. Not joy, assurance. "You're safe now. I won't leave you." A boy with cracked lips clutched him the same way, thin arms locked around the dog's chest. Officers glanced at each other, realizing what they were witnessing. The children trusted Shadow before they trusted them. He was their bridge out of darkness. Eliza was last. She sat frozen even after her chain fell, eyes darting, body rigid. Freedom looked too much like another trick. Shadow approached her slowly. He sat. He didn't lick, didn't bark. He simply looked at her, steady, patient. His breath rose in clouds, waiting. Her lips quivered. Tears spilled silently. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached forward. Her fingers brushed his muzzle, tentative, then curled deeper into his fur. A sob tore from her chest, raw and unrestrained. "He came," she whispered. "The dog came." The deputies stopped, their throats tight. Even Donnelly, iron-willed sheriff, looked away, his jaw clenched. The storm howled through the doorway, but inside, the sound was different now. Chains snapping, children crying into blankets, officers whispering reassurance. Neighbors pressed closer, their flashlights piercing the gloom. Gasps spread as children were carried out one by one. Mothers wept, though none were theirs. Fathers gripped fences until their knuckles whitened. "This was right here," one man muttered, voice breaking. "Right here, and we didn't see it." Shadow stood among the children, his coat damp, paws bloodied, chest heaving. He didn't rest, not yet, not until every last chain was cut. And when the final child stepped into the stormlight, the warehouse echoed with a sound it had never held before. Voices, alive and unbound. Sheriff Donnelly removed his hat, snow melting on his hair. His voice was heavy, reverent. "We'll never forget this night." His gaze shifted to the shepherd, surrounded by children, their small hands buried in his fur. "No one will." Outside, the storm howled, but inside the warehouse, warmth spread in small bursts. A boy clutching an officer's coat as he was carried out. A girl clinging to Shadow's fur as though he were her lifeline. Another whispering, "Don't leave us," only to be answered by the dog's steady presence. The children were fragile, trembling, their bodies weak from hunger and fear. Yet in those moments, each one began to believe in escape, not because of the radios or the officers, or even the open door, but because of the shepherd, who had not stopped barking until someone listened. Chains lay scattered across the floor now, lifeless remnants of captivity. The warehouse smelled of rust and mold, but the air was different. It was alive with voices, children crying, officers murmuring comfort, neighbors gasping as the freed were led into the stormlight. Shadow stood among them, his coat dusted with snow, his paws bloodied from clawing wood and steel. He did not rest. He moved from one child to the next, licking hands, nudging shoulders, pressing against them until their fear loosened enough for them to stand. For the first time, the warehouse no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a place broken open, its secrets spilling into the world. And as the deputies guided the children out, one after another, Shadow stayed close. His body brushed against their legs, his gaze sweeping the shadows, his ears pricked for danger. He had heard their cries, and he would not stop protecting them now. When the last child stepped into the night, the storm carried their sobs into the darkness. But mingled with them was something new. Relief, fragile but undeniable. And behind them, Shadow barked once more, his voice echoing through the hollow space, not desperate this time, but triumphant. The children shuffled out of the warehouse one by one, their small frames wrapped in blankets brought hastily from patrol cars. Deputies guided them carefully, speaking in low voices meant to soothe. The storm swirled around them, icy flakes clinging to thin hair. But no one noticed the cold anymore. They were free. Yet even as the others stumbled toward waiting vehicles, one boy lingered. He was no older than 9. His face was gaunt, his eyes too large for his thin frame. His wrists bore red circles where chains had rubbed skin raw. He stood just beyond the threshold of the warehouse, trembling, his blanket slipping from his shoulders. Deputies coaxed him gently. "Come on, son. Let's get you warm." But he didn't move. Instead, his eyes searched. They landed on Shadow. The shepherd stood a few feet away, his chest heaving from exhaustion, snow clinging to his coat. He had not left the children's side, pacing among them like a sentinel refusing to rest. His paws were torn, his throat raw from barking, yet his gaze was steady. When the boy froze in the doorway, Shadow lifted his head. Their eyes met. The boy's breath caught. His knees buckled. And then he moved. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees in the snow, arms flinging around the dog's neck with a desperation that startled even the deputies. His thin fingers knotted in Shadow's fur, clinging so tightly it seemed he feared the shepherd might vanish if he let go. Shadow did not flinch. He did not step back. He lowered his head, pressing his muzzle gently against the boy's shoulder, his body still as stone. Then, slowly, his tail gave a single sweep through the snow. The boy buried his face into Shadow's coat, sobs tearing from his chest. Weeks of silence, of fear, of swallowed tears spilled out in a flood that shook his small body. His cries were muffled against the shepherd's fur, his words broken, barely audible. "You didn't leave me," he whispered. "You didn't leave." Deputy Morales knelt nearby, his throat tightening as he watched. He had seen rescues before, but never this. He lowered his radio, giving the moment space, his eyes burning. Around them, flashlights caught the scene. A boy clinging to a battered dog, the storm swirling like a halo of snow around them. Neighbors who had gathered gasped softly, hands pressed to their mouths. One woman began to cry openly, whispering, "Look at him! Look at that dog!" The reporters had arrived by then, summoned by scanner calls, their vans parked at the end of the road. Cameras struggled against the storm, lenses fogging, but they captured it all. The boy's trembling arms, the shepherd's patient stillness, the snow falling like ash around them. Click, click, flash. The images burned onto film, destined for front pages by morning. But none of that mattered in the moment. To the boy, the world had narrowed to one truth. He had been heard. Someone had come, and that someone, against all odds, was a dog no one had wanted. Sheriff Donnelly stepped closer, his voice low. "Son, we'll get you safe. We'll take you home." But the boy shook his head violently, his arms tightening. "I'm not letting go," he said, voice muffled but fierce. "He saved me. He stays." No deputy argued. They stood in silence, their faces pale with awe. Shadow shifted slightly, adjusting his weight to brace the boy against him. He licked the child's cheek once, slow and deliberate, before settling again. His eyes, dark and steady, swept the storm as though daring it, or anyone else, to try and take this child from him. The cameras kept clicking, and with each flash, the image of hope took shape. A forgotten shepherd, bloodied and scarred, holding steady as a boy clung to him with every ounce of strength left in his body. Emma Turner, who had been among the first to hear the barking, pressed her hands to her face. Tears streaked her cheeks as she whispered to Caleb, "That picture will change everything. People will never forget it." And she was right. In the days to come, newspapers would run the photograph with headlines like "The Dog Who Wouldn't Stop" and "Hope in the Dark." Social media would spread it worldwide, strangers weeping at the sight of a child saved by the persistence of an abandoned dog. But here, at this moment, none of that mattered. The boy trembled in Shadow's embrace, and Shadow held still, a silent promise carved into the night. "You are safe. You are found. I will not leave." Minutes passed before deputies gently coaxed the boy toward the waiting ambulance. Even then, his hands clung to Shadow's fur until the last possible second. The shepherd followed, of course, climbing into the snow-bright vehicle with the child, settling at his side as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The storm raged on outside, but inside that ambulance, warmth bloomed. A boy leaning against a dog, eyes heavy with exhaustion, tears drying on his face. For the first time in weeks he slept, not chained, not afraid, but cradled against the one creature who had refused to give up on him. And outside the world shifted. The image had been captured. The face of hope had been born. And a forgotten shepherd named Shadow would never be forgotten again. By dawn, the storm had quieted. Roads lay buried in drifts, trees bent heavy with ice, and the warehouse, its doors splintered, its secrets exposed, stood silent against the grey sky. Patrol cars idled outside, their red and blue lights flashing faintly across the whitened fields. For a moment, there was quiet. But it didn't last. By mid-morning, the backcountry road clogged with vehicles that had no business there. Media vans, their antennas stabbing into the clouds, lined the shoulders in crooked rows. Reporters in thick coats stamped snow from their boots, clutching microphones, their breath rising in urgent clouds. "A shocking discovery," one announced, the ruined warehouse looming behind her. 12 children rescued from captivity in what authorities describe as one of the most disturbing trafficking cases in Ohio's history. And at the center of it all, a dog. Across networks, footage played on repeat, not just deputies carrying pale, blanket-wrapped children, but of Shadow himself. A trembling bystander's phone captured the German shepherd clawing at the warehouse doors, barking until his throat rasped. Another clip showed him circling the building through snow and wind, relentlessly. The world saw it, and the world listened. Headlines screamed across screens. "Retired K9 saves 12 children. From chained dog to national hero." The bark that broke silence. The photograph that spread fastest showed a boy's thin arms wrapped around Shadow's neck, his face pressed into the shepherd's fur, snow falling in soft streaks around them. No one knew the boy's name, but his embrace spoke for every child. The image became a symbol, and the dog at the center, a savior. In a diner 2 towns over, truckers leaned over mugs of coffee, shaking their heads. "That dog's the only reason they found them," one muttered. In a Cincinnati classroom, teachers stopped lessons, letting students watch live coverage. Children whispered, "He's like a superhero." And in homes across the country, parents drew their own children closer, tears stinging their eyes. Back in town, the sheriff's office was overwhelmed. Calls flooded in. Reporters demanding interviews, citizens offering donations, animal advocates pleading to know the shepherd's fate. Sheriff Donnelly, bleary-eyed but steady, faced the cameras. "Yes," he confirmed, his voice low but firm. "It was the dog who led us here. If not for him, I don't know how long those kids would have been trapped. He saved them." Questions flew, but Donnelly only added, "Heroes don't always wear badges. Sometimes they wear scars and fur." Behind him, Shadow sat in the snow, children still clinging to his side. The cameras caught how gently he leaned into them, how his head lowered as though he understood their fragility. Even seasoned reporters blinked back tears. Online, clips of Shadow's bark were set to music, captions declaring, "When no one else listened, he did." The boy's embrace became a meme of hope, shared thousands of times across timelines heavy with politics and despair. But in quieter corners, the story struck deeper. In Cleveland, a woman who had once trained K9s froze at the sight of the shepherd on her screen. "That's one of ours," she whispered, tears welling. "He was trained for this." The realization cut deep. A dog discarded by the system had done what the system itself failed to do. In Washington, aides carried the photo into morning briefings. "Public outcry is enormous," one warned. "People are demanding answers. How a retired service dog ended up chained on a farm instead of protected." At the center of it all, Shadow knew nothing of headlines or outrage. He knew only the smell of children's tears, the weight of their hands in his fur. His body trembled with fatigue, but he remained upright, scanning the snow as though still guarding them. Eliza, the deputy who had trusted his instincts from the beginning, leaned against him and whispered where no camera could catch. "You were the answer. I prayed, and you came." That night, Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital bustled with the chaos only disasters bring. Nurses hurried with IV bags, doctors bent over frail bodies, volunteers pushed wheelchairs down antiseptic bright halls. Parents crowded waiting rooms, coats damp with melting snow, eyes swollen from nights of fear. And then, doors opened. One by one, children emerged, pale, wrists marked, hair tangled, but alive. "Mom!" a girl cried, flinging herself into her mother's arms. A father dropped to his knees as his son shuffled forward on weak legs, gathering him into a trembling embrace. "God, I thought I lost you." Reporters pressed against glass panels, their cameras fogging with tears they couldn't hide. They had covered tragedies before, but this was different. This was what survival looked like. Yet, amid the sobs of reunion, a question echoed again and again. "Where's the dog? Is he here? Please, I want to see him." Children clutched at their parents' sleeves, repeating it with urgent reverence. Nurses traded puzzled looks until one boy whispered stubbornly, "I'm not hungry until he knows I'm safe." A nurse knelt and smoothed his hair. He knows, sweetheart. That dog knows. In room after room, children spoke not of their captivity, but of the shepherd who had stood by them. He kept us awake. He wouldn't let me cry alone. He's our hero. Always him. Always Shadow. Parents listened with awe and humility. One father, rough-handed from construction work, asked a deputy, "Who owns the dog? I want to thank them." The deputy's gaze faltered. Truth is, the dog doesn't really have anyone. Not anymore. He was discarded. The word cut deep. Discarded. And yet, the man thought his daughter was alive because of him. By midnight, the hospital overflowed with gifts from strangers. Flowers, stuffed animals, cards, scrawled with shaky handwriting. To the brave kids, to the brave dog. In a dim room, a mother sat beside her sleeping son, stroking his hair. She whispered into the stillness, "I wish I could thank him. I wish he knew." Down the hall, Shadow lay surrounded by restless children who refused to sleep without him. His head rested on a boy's lap. His tail thumped whenever small fingers brushed his fur. Deputies tried to move him, but the children's voices trembled. "Please, let him stay." So he stayed. The hospital, usually sterile and cold, transformed into something softer that night. A place where fear gave way to fur, and trembling hands found peace in the shepherd's steady presence. The courthouse square lay quiet the next evening, snow packed hard beneath boots. Shadow stretched across the cold stone steps of the sheriff's office, head on his paws, body scarred but resolute. He wasn't commanded to be there. He simply knew it was his place. Neighbors began to arrive, not reporters, not officials, just ordinary people carrying quilts, thermoses, and teddy bears. One woman laid down a scarf and whispered, "Thank you for giving us back our children." Shadow's tail thudded once in acknowledgement. Soon the steps looked less like government property and more like a shrine. Flowers and candles lined the stone, flames bending in the winter wind, but refusing to die. Handwritten notes fluttered on the wall. "Hero, protector, we will never forget." Children bundled in coats, huddled near him. One boy knelt, pressed his cheek to Shadow's fur and whispered, "I'm not scared anymore because you're here." Cameras clicked, but his words belonged only to the dog. A retired firefighter placed a folded American flag by Shadow's side. His voice cracked as he saluted. "You've served better than most of us ever could." Deputies once tried coaxing him inside, but he refused. He would not leave the children's sight, nor the town's. Like a sentry carved from loyalty itself, he remained. By dusk, the vigil swelled. Strangers from distant counties arrived, candles in hand. From above, the square shimmered with hundreds of flickering lights encircling one dog. The sheriff stepped outside, gazed at the shepherd resting on his steps, and finally spoke. "This dog," he said, voice carrying across the silent crowd, "has done more for this county in one night than most of us manage in a lifetime." The people answered not with applause but with silence. Thick, reverent silence. Deep in the night, when crowds thinned and candles guttered low, Shadow lifted his head. The town slept. The children slept. Yet his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the horizon. He had walked out of shadows and into history, not as a stray, not as discarded, but as a protector claimed by everyone. And on those courthouse steps, beneath quilts, flowers, and the weight of a community's gratitude, he rested at last, not chained, not forgotten, but honored, as sentinel in the snow. The courthouse square had never held so many people. Word had spread far beyond county lines, and by noon, the crowd stretched shoulder to shoulder. Farmers in worn coats, mothers clutching children who had only just been freed, church choirs, veterans, even strangers who had driven hours to stand in witness. At the center, a wooden platform draped in the American flag waited. Shadow sat at the front, his coat brushed until it gleamed in the winter sun. Around his neck hung the tarnished service badge he had once worn as a K9. The sheriff himself had fastened it, his hands trembling as though he were pinning a medal on a soldier. When the badge clicked into place, the crowd erupted, not with cheers for spectacle, but with gratitude. The sheriff's voice cracked as he stepped to the microphone. Today, we honor more than a dog. We honor courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. Shadow was trained to protect us, then discarded. But when evil hid in our own backyard, he remembered his oath. He saved our children. Behind him stood retired canine handlers, saluting with photographs of their own long-buried partners. Veterans bowed their heads. Teachers and doctors added their voices, recalling how children had whispered Shadow's name, even as IVs dripped into their arms. Then a boy stepped forward, no older than 8. He gripped the microphone, his small voice trembling but clear. When I thought nobody could hear me, you did. He dropped to his knees and hugged Shadow tightly around the neck. Cameras clicked, but the moment felt sacred. As a choir began to sing Amazing Grace, veterans stepped forward one by one, laying tokens at Shadow's paws. A leash, a brass tag, a folded patch. A circle of memories gathered around him, not marble monuments, but living proof of a legacy carried forward. The sheriff returned to the microphone, softer now. Every generation asks what it will remember. For us, it will be this. The night a forgotten dog showed us what loyalty means. By the power vested in me, I restore Shadow to his full honors as a member of the K9 unit. A deputy placed a medal across the shepherd's chest. The crowd broke into sobs and cheers. Flags waved, but Shadow stayed composed, eyes steady, scanning the crowd as if still on duty. Parents came forward to testify. A mother, voice breaking, said, "If not for him, I'd have buried my child." A father admitted, "I taught my boy to be brave, but it was Shadow who protected him when I could not." Each story layered grief into gratitude until the square itself seemed to tremble with it. Finally, a small girl, hospital band still around her wrist, whispered into the microphone, "He didn't just save me, he stayed. When I touched his fur, it felt like the world couldn't hurt me anymore." She looked down at the shepherd. "He's the reason I'm here." The silence that followed was broken only by a single voice. "God bless him." The words spread through the crowd until thousands echoed them in unison. Shadow sat quietly at the center, tail brushing the wood of the stage, as though he knew this moment was not for him to claim, but to give. By dawn the next morning, Shadow's story was everywhere. Splashed across newspapers, replayed on national broadcasts, shared endlessly online. Forgotten K9 saves 12. Hero dog ends nightmare. From neglected to national treasure. In Washington, a congresswoman and veteran stood on the House floor, her voice shaking. "We ask soldiers to give everything." Shadow reminded us that our dogs are soldiers too. We owe him, and every animal like him, better. Her words drew rare bipartisan applause. Petitions called for new laws, funding for retired service dogs, permanent recognition for K9 units. Within hours, Shadow's law had hundreds of thousands of signatures. Animal shelters reported surges in donations and volunteers. Hashtags bloomed across social media. Stand with Shadow, hashtag Hero Dog, hashtag Never Forgotten. But beyond politics, something deeper stirred. Families lit candles in their windows. Schools taught lessons on courage and loyalty, playing the rescue footage for children. Strangers drove across states just to leave flowers by the sheriff's office steps. Letters poured in, crayon drawings, poems, folded notes scrawled simply, "Thank you, Shadow." Through it all, Shadow remained unchanged. He lay calmly outside the sheriff's office, medal across his chest, steady as ever. Veterans saluted him. Children whispered secrets into his fur. Reporters lowered their voices in his presence, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. He didn't understand headlines or petitions or politics, but he understood the boy's arms around his neck. He understood the trembling hands that touched him with reverence. And he understood, perhaps for the first time in years, that he was no longer alone. Shadow had not just saved 12 children. He had pulled an entire town, and soon a nation, back into the light. The forgotten dog had become a sentinel, a reminder of the loyalty we had nearly forgotten, and the love we could no longer ignore. The day was grey, with clouds sagging low over the snow-dusted fields around a small farmhouse. For years, this house had been Shadow's prison, where the German shepherd, who once saved lives, was left chained, shivering against the wind. Now, reporters and cameras crowded the gravel road, lenses fixed on the weathered building. Inside, the sheriff stood before the farmer, Mr. Harlan, who twisted a frayed cap in trembling hands. "Mr. Harlan," the sheriff said, his voice measured but sharp. "Why was Shadow left chained? Why was he neglected after everything he gave?" The farmer swallowed, stammering excuses. "He's just a dog. I had other responsibilities." The words hung in the air like smoke, brittle and hollow. Outside, the murmur of the gathered crowd rose in anger. To them, Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was the one who had broken into a trafficker's den, barking until deputies found 12 imprisoned children. He was a savior, a hero, and Harlan had abandoned him. "You abandoned him!" someone shouted through the cameras outside. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Veterans shook their heads. Even seasoned reporters felt their throats close. The sheriff leaned closer. "He saved 12 children. He gave his years of service without complaint. And you left him to freeze on a chain. There's no excuse. Not to me, not to this town, and not to the families of those kids." Harlan's mouth opened and closed, but no defense came. For the first time, he looked small. Not in stature, but in conscience. His muttered excuses were drowned out by a truth too heavy to escape. The world had judged him, and rightly so. By the time winter thinned into spring, the courthouse steps bore the weight of crowds. Parents held folded hands, veterans stood in solemn lines, and strangers drove for hours just to witness what would follow. Inside courtroom 2, the air hummed with reverence and grief. The indictment was long: unlawful restraint, trafficking, conspiracy, cruelty. Each charge built a wall around the defendants. Men in expensive suits, whose arrogance was gone now, leaving only pale silence. The prosecutor spoke softly, letting silence carry weight. "We will show you a warehouse meant to swallow children. We will show you the locks, the chains. And we will show you how the silence was broken. By a dog long forgotten by those who should have remembered him." He let the outline widen, and then, finally, the name. His name is Shadow. Testimony began. Deputy Morales told of that freezing night, how the storm muffled everything but Shadow's relentless bark. "I've broken down plenty of doors," he said, voice trembling. "But I've never followed a dog through one." Sheriff Donnelly followed, recalling the moment children's hands clutched fur before they dared trust human palms. "You can call it instinct," he said. "I call it devotion." Then came the children. Behind privacy screens, with blankets across their laps, they spoke with voices both fragile and strong. An older girl said, "We didn't talk much. We were afraid. But at night, we heard him. He barked like he had our names in his mouth. I knew someone was out there." A boy, hospital band still faint on his wrist, whispered, "I counted. I made it to 100, and he was still barking. He beat the numbers." And Eliza, the smallest, lifted her chin. "I prayed for an angel. A dog came." The courtroom fell silent. Even hardened jurors wept. When the state played a neighbor's recording, wind howling, metal straining, and beneath it Shadow's measured, desperate bark, the sound filled every corner. Jurors pressed hands to mouths. The defense's cross-examinations fell flat, unable to puncture what the children had given. Truth, unembellished, carried on small voices. Verdict week arrived. The jury's words cut through the courthouse. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each repetition struck like a bell. Families embraced. Strangers cried. One boy rose in the gallery, turning not to the defendants, but to the crowd. "He saved me," he said simply. "His name is Shadow." Even the judge's closing words carried the weight of a dog's loyalty. "This court cannot sentence courage into existence," she said, "but it can acknowledge it when it walks into our lives on 4 tired feet and refuses to leave." Outside, the courthouse square exhaled. Children, hand in hand with their parents, walked slowly toward the elm tree where Shadow sometimes lay. When they reached him, they stretched out small palms, 1, 2, 12, and he lowered his muzzle as if counting back each soul he had saved. But the story did not end with the verdict. As the trial closed, journalists dug into old files, and veterans came forward with voices cracking under the weight of memory. Who was Shadow before he became the dog the world now knew? Sergeant Matthew Doyle spoke first, holding a faded photo of a younger shepherd in a tactical vest, eyes alive with focus. "This dog," Doyle said, "was the difference between my team coming home and not coming home at all." He described a raid in Kandahar, where Shadow, then known as Rex, sniffed out a hidden tunnel insurgents planned to use for an ambush. "If not for him," Doyle whispered, "I wouldn't be here." He saved fathers, brothers, husbands. Lieutenant Karen Michaels recalled a hostage mission in a remote village. A child had been taken. Shadow pressed his nose against a cellar door, pawed once, twice, then threw his weight against it. Inside, a trembling girl was found alive. She wrapped her arms around his neck. "Not mine," Michaels said through tears. She knew who saved her. Other soldiers spoke of nights when Shadow curled against their cots after they lost friends, his sighs reminding them they weren't alone. He had carried not only their missions, but their grief. Old mission logs confirmed it. Operation Steel Gate. Explosives detected before convoy ambush. Operation Dawnlight. Hostage located. Operation Silent Echo. Tunnels mapped by K9 Shadow. The records were stark, but paired with the voices of handlers, they became stories of lives spared, of devotion that outlived uniforms and orders. Not every story was triumphant. Sergeant Doyle admitted Shadow carried scars. He remembered the explosion that ended their partnership. Fire, smoke, chaos. Shadow had vanished in the blast, presumed dead. "I blamed myself every day," Doyle said, tears wetting his beard. "And then I learned he survived. After all that, he still chose to save people. That's who he was." In living rooms across the nation, people leaned closer to their screens. They weren't just hearing about a dog. They were learning what loyalty meant, what it cost, and how it endured even in betrayal. A child rescued from the warehouse was shown these testimonies. When asked if he wanted to say anything, he placed his small hand on his chest. "He's not just a dog," he said softly. "He's a soldier." The words became a headline, a rallying cry. They traveled farther than any courtroom, farther than any broadcast. By week's end, the nation knew Shadow's history. Deserts crossed, bombs detected, children rescued, soldiers comforted. From war zones to a farmhouse chain, his journey had become a mosaic of courage. The lesson was undeniable. Loyalty does not vanish. It lingers in scars, in memory, in every life it has touched. Shadow's past bled seamlessly into his present, reminding the world that courage, once forged, never dies. And so, when people speak his name now, they speak not only of a dog who saved 12 children, but of a lifetime defined by devotion, a devotion that outlived neglect, chains, and human indifference. Shadow's story is not just about survival. It is about what we owe to those who give everything without asking anything in return. The marble halls of the Capitol echoed with footsteps that morning. Animal welfare debates rarely drew much attention, but this day was different. Shadow's story, a war dog forgotten, chained, yet rising to rescue 12 children, had swept the nation. His name had become a symbol, and symbols, once born, are not easily silenced. In a high-ceilinged committee room, lawmakers shuffled papers, eyes weary, but voices taut with urgency. At the head of the table, Senator Miriam Collins tapped her pen. "We're not here to argue if Shadow is a hero. That's already been decided in the hearts of the people. We're here because the public is asking one question. How many more Shadows will be forgotten before we act?" Across from her, Chief Raymond Holt of the police union shifted uncomfortably. "You know the costs, Senator. Medical care, retirement housing. Departments are already stretched thin. We honor these dogs, but budgets..." "Budgets," snapped Maria Sanchez, head of an animal welfare coalition. Her voice cut like steel. "You honored Shadow by auctioning him off like broken equipment. You honored him by chaining him to a barn wall. Let's call it what it is. Abandonment." The room fell silent. No one could erase the sting of truth. Senator Collins raised a hand. "We cannot rewrite the past. But we can shape the future. What we draft here will decide whether this country chooses gratitude or forgetfulness." Drafting boards rolled in. Legal aids stacked precedent documents. On the screen appeared bold letters: the Canine Justice and Dignity Act. The preamble declared, "In recognition of the unwavering service, loyalty, and sacrifice of law enforcement and military working dogs, it is the duty of this nation to ensure their retirement is marked not by neglect, but by dignity." The provisions took shape quickly. Dedicated retirement funds, guaranteed veterinary care, no auction or sale, ever. Dogs would be placed only with trained handlers or sanctuaries. A public registry would ensure accountability. Medals and memorials would honor their service. Every clause circled back to Shadow. At one point, an older congressman rose, voice trembling. "I served in Fallujah. We had a dog named Ajax. saved more lives than I can count. When I rotated home, I heard he was listed as equipment disposed. I didn't fight for that. His eyes shone with tears. Pens began to move again, faster now. By dusk, drafts littered the table. Senator Collins leaned back, weary but resolute. "When this reaches the floor," she murmured, "it won't just be policy. It will be a promise." The next morning, the chamber was packed. Reporters lined the gallery. Veterans in faded uniforms sat beside children clutching stuffed dogs. Outside, crowds carried signs. "Heroes deserve homes. Never another shadow." At the heart of the debate was money. "Who will pay for this?" one senator thundered. "We are talking millions annually for dogs no longer in service. Where do we draw the line?" A representative rose instantly, voice burning with fury. "Where we draw the line, Senator, is where loyalty ends. These dogs gave their lives for us, and too often we repay them with neglect." Shadow's story is not an outlier. It's a mirror. And we must look. The chamber erupted. Cheers, shouts, the speaker's gavel pounding. Still, resistance lingered. An older congressman adjusted his glasses. "Our duty is to people first. How do we justify cutting health care for children to pay for animals? Are we to say a German shepherd deserves more than a struggling child?" For a moment, silence held. The argument, cold but sharp, seemed to cut the bill's momentum. Then from the gallery, a veteran rose. His chest bore ribbons, his voice cracked. "I had a dog. Her name was Reva. She pulled me from rubble, took shrapnel so I wouldn't. When I came home, she died in a kennel, forgotten. Don't you dare tell me this is about numbers. This is about dignity." The chamber stilled. Faces turned away, some lawmakers scribbling notes to mask the shame in their eyes. The debate dragged into the evening. And then came the moment that changed everything. A young congresswoman, in her first term, lifted a faded photograph. A little girl, frail in a hospital gown, clung to a German shepherd. "This is my sister," she said, her voice shaking. "She's alive because of a police dog named Shadow. My family doesn't ask about budgets. We ask one question. When the next Shadow finishes his duty, will we betray him again, or finally honor him?" The photo passed from hand to hand. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Suddenly, the bill wasn't abstract. It had a face, a child, and a dog. By nightfall, resistance was fragile. The speaker's gavel thundered. "The vote will be held tomorrow." The morning of the vote, the Capitol hummed with anticipation. Banners bearing Shadow's image lined the square. Inside, the gallery overflowed with veterans, officers, children, and families. At the front row sat Ethan, Shadow at his side, the shepherd sitting tall despite his stiff legs, ears pricked as if sensing the weight of history. The speaker called the chamber to order. A representative rose. "For years, dogs like Shadow have served in silence, sniffing out explosives, standing between bullets and their partners. Too often, they are cast aside when their duty ends. Forgotten, sold. That ends today." Applause thundered. Ethan bent low, whispering into Shadow's ear. The shepherd leaned against him, steady as ever. The roll call began. One by one, voices answered. "Aye." Each sounded like a stone laid on the bridge from betrayal to recognition. When the tally was read, the numbers glowed green. The bill had passed. For a beat, silence held. Then it shattered into cheers. Veterans embraced. Reporters scrambled. Families wept openly. Ethan rose with Shadow. The old shepherd wagged his tail, slow but proud. A uniformed officer reached across the rail. "You did it, boy," he whispered. "You finally did it." The speaker's voice trembled as he struck the gavel. "By the will of this body, the Service Animal Protection and Honor Act is hereby adopted." Outside, the crowd erupted. Chants rolled like thunder. "Shadow! Shadow! Shadow!" Cameras captured the shepherd blinking in the sunlight as Ethan led him down the steps, the roar of his name rising like a hymn. For many, the law was more than policy. It was a promise that retired canines would never again be abandoned. They would have health care, homes, honor. Their names would not fade. They would be remembered alongside the human officers they had protected. At the railing, a small boy tugged his mother's hand. "Mama," he whispered, "that's the dog who saves people?" His mother knelt, eyes shining. "Yes, sweetheart. And now, people are saving him too." The boy ran forward, reaching out timidly. Shadow lowered his head, letting the child's hand rest against his fur. In that quiet touch, the past and the future seemed to fold together, gratitude flowing from one generation to the next. Later, as the sun set over the Capitol dome, Ethan sat with Shadow on the marble steps. The crowds had thinned, the chants softened into memory. Ethan laid his hand on the shepherd's chest, feeling the steady beat beneath his palm. "You did it, partner," he whispered. "They'll never forget dogs like you again." Shadow's eyes met his, calm and knowing. He had never asked for recognition. His loyalty had always been its own reward. But now, at last, a nation has risen to say the words he would never speak for himself. "You are not forgotten." And as the flag rippled above them, Ethan realized that Shadow was more than a companion, more than a savior. He was a symbol, and symbols, once born of sacrifice, never die. The courthouse had emptied, its echoes fading into memory. For Shadow, the German shepherd whose courage had shattered both locks and silence, a different door was about to open. The adoption papers were signed quietly on a grey Thursday afternoon. No reporters. No cameras. Just a desk, an officer with tired eyes, and a family waiting with nerves and gratitude written across their faces. At the center stood Daniel. His small hand clutched his mother's, the same hand he had held when she carried him from the basement where darkness had almost erased his childhood. His eyes, still shadowed, widened when Shadow stepped through the doorway. The dog paused. His scarred paws hesitated on the tile. He lifted his head, met the boy's gaze, and in that instant, recognition passed between them. Both had survived the same nightmare. Now, somehow, fate had braided their paths together again. Daniel let go of his mother's hand. Slowly, as though approaching something fragile, he whispered, "It's him, Mom. It's really him." Shadow's tail flicked once, then again, stronger. He lowered his head. Daniel's arms wrapped around his neck, and Shadow leaned into the embrace, as if he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. The officer, who had signed hundreds of transfers, felt her throat tighten. Daniel's mother pressed a hand to her chest, whispering thanks she wasn't sure were meant for the officials, the dog, or heaven itself. Shadow had found his forever home. The house was modest, set at the edge of town where fields stretched wide. Nothing remarkable, just the smell of soup simmering, drawings taped to the refrigerator, books piled by the sofa. For Shadow, it was another world. That first night, he didn't settle easily. He paced the hallway, ears pricked at every sound. The scrape of branches against glass, the distant horn of a car. His body tensed, waiting for orders that would never come. The chain around his neck was gone, replaced by a soft collar, but memory lingered. It was Daniel who anchored him. The boy spread a blanket beside his bed and patted it gently. "Here, Shadow. This is yours." The dog hesitated, then lowered himself onto the fabric. He didn't close his eyes immediately. He watched the boy until his breathing slowed into sleep. Only then did Shadow's eyelids grow heavy. For the first time in years, he slept not on concrete, not in chains, but in warmth. Morning brought something Shadow had almost forgotten, routine without duty. Daniel's laughter at spilled cereal, the clatter of school books, his small hands cupping Shadow's muzzle. "I'll be back after school, okay?" And each afternoon, when the bus sighed to a stop, Shadow was waiting. His tail thumped against the porch rail as Daniel ran down the lane, backpack bouncing. Their reunions were not dramatic. They were steady, healing. His mother often watched from the doorway, eyes wet, knowing she was seeing something rare. A child whose innocence was slowly being stitched back together by a dog who asked nothing in return. But Shadow carried his past. Some nights he woke with a start, chest heaving, eyes wild. Gunfire. Chains. Commands shouted into smoke. On those nights, it was Daniel who rose, curling beside the trembling dog. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're home now. Nobody's going to hurt you." The roles reversed. A boy comforting a soldier, a child teaching a warrior to rest. That was the symmetry of their bond. Each healed the other in ways no one else could. The hearth became Shadow's favorite spot. He would lie there, the flames painting his coat gold, while Daniel read aloud from adventure books. Sometimes the boy's voice faltered, but Shadow never moved. His presence was enough. Neighbors noticed the change in Daniel. Once, he walked with shoulders hunched, eyes wary. Now he walked with Shadow at his side, head higher, steps surer. "That dog gave my son back to me," his mother confided, and for Shadow, the gift was just as profound. After years of being treated as a tool, he was no longer a soldier or burden. He was family. At night, Daniel's whispers filled the dark. At first they were short and desperate. I thought they'd never open the door. I thought I'd never see Mom again. Later, they spilled out like secrets too heavy to keep. "I prayed for you, even though I didn't know your name. Sometimes I still see the dark. But when I touch you, it goes away." Shadow listened. He didn't turn away or urge the boy to forget. He simply lay steady, his heartbeat thudding beneath Daniel's hand. That constant was worth more than words. When nightmares came, breaking into muffled screams, Shadow leapt onto the bed, pressing his weight across Daniel's legs, grounding him. Slowly, the boy's cries softened. His fists unclenched, his sobs tapered into hiccups, then slept. His parents, helpless at the doorway, wept in silence, realizing there were wounds only fur and loyalty could reach. One stormy night, Daniel whispered into Shadow's ear, "They called you a hero, but you saved me more here." You saved the part of me that was still a little boy." He smiled through tears, and for the first time since the rescue, he slept without fear. Years passed. Daniel grew taller, his voice deeper, but each evening Shadow still waited by the door. The boy who once whispered nightmares now told him dreams, college, adventures, the kind of future he never thought he'd have. Shadow aged. His muzzle grayed, his steps slowed, but his eyes, those steady amber eyes, remained the same. When at last the old shepherd's breath grew shallow, Daniel lay beside him, his hand on that broad chest, whispering, "Don't leave me." And Shadow, as always, stayed until the end, his loyalty unbroken. The morning of the statue unveiling, the county square shimmered with sunlight. A crowd gathered on the courthouse steps where Shadow's courage had once been spoken of in verdicts and testimony. Beneath a heavy cloth stood the shape of a German shepherd cast in bronze. Sheriff Daniels, retired but still carrying the weight of his badge, stepped forward. "We gather not just to unveil a statue," he said, voice gravelly with age, "but to honor a life that changed us. Shadow was abandoned once, broken and cast aside. But he proved, through courage, through devotion, that loyalty never dies." The cloth was pulled away. Gasps rippled. There he was, Shadow, immortalized in bronze. Ears pricked, chest proud, eyes that seemed almost alive. Beneath his paws, a plaque gleamed. He was abandoned. He became a savior. Loyalty never dies. Children laid flowers at the base. Veterans saluted. Flags folded sharply against their chests. Families pressed palms to the cold bronze, whispering thanks. At the front stood Daniel, no longer a boy, but a man. He brushed his fingers over the bronze fur, remembering whispered secrets in the dark, nights when Shadow had anchored him through storms no one else could calm. A lump rose in his throat. "You never left me," he whispered, "and I'll never leave you." The statue became more than a monument. Officers touched the muzzle before patrols. Children drew pictures to tuck at its base. Families told Shadow's story as if it were scripture. And at night, the street lamps cast his bronze silhouette long across the square, as if he were still standing guard. When newcomers asked who the dog was, old-timers always answered the same way. "That's Shadow. He taught us that even the broken have value. That loyalty isn't trained, it's given. And when it's given, it deserves to be honored." For Daniel, the statue was not stone and metal. It was a promise that Shadow's life had meant something, that his sacrifices would not be forgotten, that loyalty once given truly never dies. And so, beneath the gaze of a bronze shepherd, the legend of Shadow lived on, not only in the county that had once tried to forget him, but in every heart that heard his story and found within it the courage to believe in second chances. When we think about the story of Shadow, it reminds us of something simple yet profound. Dogs don't measure love in years, medals, or possessions. They give it freely, and they give it for life. A German shepherd like Shadow doesn't ask for much in return, just a place to belong, a gentle hand, and the chance to stand by someone they love. That loyalty, that quiet devotion, is what makes the bond between people and dogs so powerful. If you've ever had a dog curl up at your feet on a hard day, or felt their head rest gently on your knee when words weren't enough, you know that it's more than companionship. It's family, it's healing, it's love, pure and unconditional. And if you've been wondering how you can deepen that connection with your own dog, Maybe learn to read them a little better, or give back some of the comfort they've given you. There's a wonderful resource I came across that might help. No pressure, of course, but I thought I'd share it in case it brings you closer to your four-legged friend. Because in the end, loyalty like theirs deserves nothing less.